series, Freedom Through Education, or as Michael says, Education Through Freedom. You haven't figured out which, right, Michael? Either way, the first two lectures have been wonderful. This one's, I promise me, be even better. So we thank you very much for joining us. We thank Dr. West, Mr. Scarlett for being the teachers and educators that they are, as well as a cameraman.
Yeah.
If you want people coming in, we're ready to go when you're ready to go. Ms. Evans.
Okay, thanks.
All right, we have Carol coming in as well.
Yeah. There must be 16 empty chairs here.
I think there are some people here that have not been here before, and so I'm going to speak for a second to kind of catch up on what's happened in here in the last two meetings.
We've got a few more people that are.
And then Robert's going to present the bulk of the material today. We started with the idea of Somerville had a pattern of supporting education in its history, which is not typical of a lot of small southern towns. History was education was a big deal in the New England colonies very early. The first public effort at education in America in the English colonies was at Dorchester, Massachusetts.
Yes.
The people of Dorchester, Massachusetts are the people that settled Dorchester here in colonial Dorchester. It's the same people. And the very first school, that's recognized the first public school in America, was founded in Dorchester, Massachusetts in the 1640s. In the 1640s. The Dorchester colonists came down to the Ashley River in 1696, and they carried with them this tradition of free schools. Now, this was a religious colony. They were Calvinists, the people that we would call Puritans, and they were part of a very important part of the Reformation was education, and the reason was that the Reformation emphasized the reading of the Bible. And to read the Bible, you had to be literate, and to be literate, you had to get an education, and so that this became part of the Reformation culture out of Europe in the 1500s, going into the 1600s. The free school system probably began in England in the 1600s, or perhaps earlier. The printing press was first made in just before Columbus discovered America, and they were printing books then. By 1600 into 1700, books were becoming more and more available beyond the Bible, and so children were being educated more and more outside of the wealthy people who could send their children off to tutors and send them to colleges and things like that. In the South, the culture did not particularly support public education, but free schools started in South Carolina in early 1700s in colonial South Carolina. The funding of free schools was by taxing property primarily, and this included, by the way, taxing slaveholders per capita for the enslaved people that they had in their work, along with land. And so the support for the free schools came out of these people's paying taxes for it. The children who were qualified for the free schools were designated by certain committees, school boards, sometimes municipal judges would designate a child as being eligible, and this person then would be enrolled in the free school. Along with the children that were in the free school, because of this system for indigent children, was anybody could get into a free school if they could pay for it. And so a lot of children then would be in the free school with their parents paying for it, basically. That's how that worked. So this is what was going on then, and then as Robert spoke of in the first talk, the Denmark-Vesey rebellion, the Stoner Rebellion of 1739, the Denmark-Vesey plot or attempted revolt in the 1800s tightened what we call the black codes. The black codes basically began by forbidding black people from learning to write, and then finally to prevent them from learning to read as well. It became illegal to teach black people to read and write in South Carolina somewhere around 1830 or so. It wasn't done anymore. And so if you actually were breaking the law if you were teaching someone, a black person, to read or write. Meanwhile, the white Southerners, most of them were not getting educated as well. In Somerville, we talked last week about what happened in Somerville during the war. There were free schools here. There was a free school here. The free school went on into the Civil War, but basically probably was not functional by the end of the war because the people didn't have money, number one, and number two, everybody was out fighting the war. The main teacher at Somerville was a guy named John Gadsden. John Gadsden picked it up after the war again, started the free school operating here in Somerville. And there was actually a building here that the Free School Board supported. It was out on Central Avenue. And children were going to that school then after the war at some level. It's hard to say at what level. The Reconstruction schools is what we talked about in the second talk, and the Reconstruction schools were here for about 5 years after the Civil War, educating both black and white children. And then these were supported by benevolent societies, primarily in New England, that they called the Freedmen's Aid Society, that was centered in Boston. Individual towns in New England would literally hire a school mistress to come south, no telling where they'd be. They were assigned by the General Society out of Boston to some place. Somerville had several school mistresses from New England here actively teaching here for several years after the Civil War. They were both black and white children. They were both male and female children. The school at one point had over 100 children in it. This is with one or two of the school marms being teaching for over 100 children. For those of you who are public school teachers, you can think about that one in your fevered nightmares. So now we're into the time of 1875 and on. This is after the Reconstruction. The Civil War had wrecked this place. There really wasn't any money here. The plantation system was broken up. The people who had money, for the most part, had lost. Most of them had lost it, and there was a whole lot of loss, general loss of the families of casualties in the war, and a lot of displacement of people. People wandering around, not knowing exactly where they lived anymore, and things like that. There was some effort at organization through the 1868 South Carolina Constitution to get South Carolina back into the Union after the war.
Sure.
The Constitution called for public education funded by the state legislature, but this kind of closed down the Reconstruction schools by 1870 in this area, as best I can tell. The Reconstruction schools were about gone by 1870, and meanwhile the legislature did not come up with the money to fund the schools. And so we're back to the system that was before the war of local raising of funds. There was a really interesting fund that started in 1867 by a fellow named George Peabody, who is a Massachusetts philanthropist, a very wealthy man, who wanted to fund education in the South. But he had matching funds, and he was not building schools. He was educating. He was educating through systems that were already set up, and the free school system would be an example of that, where we already have a system of how the schooling works and how the funding is accumulated. And we have accounting and teachers and all the rest of it. The system's there. It just needs funds. And the way he funded it was by saying you do matching funds. You raise this money locally, we'll give you something out of the endowment for that. This ended up in helping primarily white children and not black children, because there weren't black schools at that point. And so it wasn't intentionally that way, it's just this way it worked. The existing schools were for white children. In Somerville, there was a high school for a couple of years that probably had Peabody funds with it, but we just lost track of it. We don't have any information on it. I just know that it was here for a couple of years. The high school is an unusual advance in education, especially in this area, and it did not last very long. In the 1878 or so, there were about 4 black children to every 3 white children in South Carolina. The ones who were the indigent children who were receiving education that we know about was heavily balanced toward the white children. And this had to do with apparently the way the funding was working. The funding was being raised primarily for white children. And so at this point now, we had at Somerville, we had a big earthquake in 1886, which wrecked everything, including schools and everything else. Everything went down in the earthquake. In 1888, Somerville was declared by a large international physicians conference in Paris to be one of the 2 healthiest places in the world. And people started coming to Somerville to get away from tuberculosis and pulmonary illnesses because they thought this place was healthy. That's when the Pine Forest Inn went up and a whole lot of great big inns went up. Now this was a time when people from Southerners, I mean these are mostly wealthy people from the north and from Europe even, were coming to Somerville and staying here for weeks, months, or even years. They even had permanent residences here. This is 1890 or so. Now they came with them with ideas that were certainly not part of the Southern culture at that time, about education and about culture in general. And they had a lot of money, and a lot of them had a lot of education. Because of the part about the health, there are a lot of educated people like doctors were down here with their families, and that's why they were here, is because of this was a health resort at that point. And so these people came in out of all over the place, and people around here call them people from off. I don't know where you're from, but if you're not from around here, that's where you're from. And so the people from off came in here with their money and started doing stuff. And that's what Robert's going to talk to you about now.
Okay, the second act of our play is Mr. Robert Scarlett. He's an educator at Cross High School, and we're proud to say he's running this lecture series with us. He will be back. We won't let him go. I've got his car keys as well. And before you leave, could I ask you, if you haven't signed in, please. This is our Christmas card list.
Okay, hello again. Nice to see you all. As always, you know, Ed, right from the top of his head, I gotta have notes. He's not as good as Ed, but I'm getting there. I'm working on it. But I just want to start by saying thank you. Thank you. No one knew what to expect when we came up with this lecture series. The response has been phenomenal, as you can see in this room. As a kid from Philly, I never know what to expect in the South. I'm still adjusting and learning things about the South. You guys are very polite. We're not used to that in Philadelphia. You're very polite. I've been here, my wife and I, over a decade now, so we're adjusting. But I just wanted to take the time to say thank you. It's been great. And as Ed kind of summarized, we talked about, what have we been talking about? This is the 3rd lecture. What were the other lectures about? I'm glad he had mentioned Denmark Vesey and the Stoner Rebellion and the rights that were lost. A lot of people don't realize, because a lot of you weren't at the first one, because the size was a lot smaller, so I know that many of you weren't here at the first one. The fact that African Americans were literate before that time. Many of them were used as bookkeepers and secretaries and accountants, all that kind of stuff, until Denmark Vesey planned his raid with 7,000 different folk, and we can't let them write anymore. They make plans and stuff when they write. And so they banned writing. So that was really part of our first lecture. What did we lose during that first speech? Why did we lose things? Came out of that first speech. And the second one, Ed painted this, which is fabulous. That second lecture talked a lot about the United States colored troops that were here. the fact that South Carolina had among some of the first South Carolina, where we had Union troops before the famous 54th Massachusetts, right? They started here in South Carolina. So that was mind-blowing. But more importantly, how that unit that came here, things like they helped rebuild Bacon's Bridge after the war, and they were educated by the commander's wife. And just a quick touch on that, the commander's wife, the commander himself, I love talking about this part, the commander himself was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, great abolitionist and of course Uncle Tom cabin writer from the North. And that leads us to where we are today, talking about education in Somerville. You gotta forgive me, love me after the first section, then you will love me in the next two sections. The first section is a little tough. You know, not everybody likes to talk a lot about the first section, so just bear with me. Let me give you my disclaimer. I'm trying to be as polite as your Southern folk. Give you my disclaimer. I understand that a lot of people in here have for years celebrated their heritage, sons, daughters, granddaughters of people who fought on the Confederate side during the war. Nothing wrong with that. I'm a historian. I can appreciate people celebrating heritages and keeping that alive. I don't have a problem with that. But what I'm going to talk about is how some of that was kind of forced upon those who may not necessarily agree with that way of seeing things, and doing it specifically, and as I would say insidiously, through the school system. That's the first part we're going to talk about. I often ask my students, like, why is it that we have schools named after Robert E. Lee, schools named after Jefferson Davis, parks honoring Stonewall Jackson? Why do we do that? I mean, you think there are any children that attend Adolf Hitler Middle School in New Jersey? Or King George III High School in Somerville? You're not going to have that. You're really not, you're only going to have that. But African American children are attending Jefferson Davis Middle School, right? Robert E. Lee High School. Why are we doing that? How did that happen? Why are our kids still exposed to celebrating the Confederacy? Well, another thing I often tell my students is history is written by the victors. Those who win get to write the history books. Those who conquered the land, those are the ones who tell their version of the story. A thing that I love to say is, how would our history books read if they were written by the Native Americans? Would they read a little differently? Yeah, they probably would. This may not be the heroic founding of the West, and go west, young man. Yeah, it might not be how it reads to them. So how did that happen? That's what we're going to talk about today. How did that happen? Civil War is the only war that violates that principle of history being written by the victor. Quite often, even today still, much of our history was written by the loser, retelling their story of what happened during the Civil War, Reconstruction, and all that time afterwards. In an article titled Rewriting History, published at Georgia State, Professor Chandra Bowen discovered how the lost cause came to dominate U.S. history books. Now, I'm not just talking about the history of the South. I'm talking about the history books where I grew up, in the North. And doing this research, I realized, like, whoa, this is what we learned in Philadelphia. You mean that wasn't true? It's amazing what we find. I teach U.S. history at Cross High School. And I look at these history books, and we talk about the fact, and I won't go too far off track, because I'll talk about that later when we talk about textbook committees. So let's start by defining the lost cause. What are we talking about? According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the lost cause is an interpretation of the American Civil War, viewed by most historians as a myth that attempts to preserve the honor of the South by casting the Confederate defeat in the best possible light. It attributes the loss to the overwhelming Union advantage in manpower and resources, nostalgically celebrates an antebellum South of supposedly benevolent slave owners and contented enslaved people. That's the lost cause. Not the Civil War that I know about, but that's the narrative, right? So in 1930s, a so-called mint julep You ever heard that expression before? Not to drink, but as a history. The mint julep are pro-Confederate portrayal of figures like John Wilkes Booth, the man that assassinated President Abraham Lincoln, Nathan Bedford Forrest, Confederate general responsible for the slaughter of black Union troops surrendering at the massacre of Fort Pillow, and he's also the founder of the KKK. They were redefined as people who were just misunderstood. That's why a lot of the history books portray them. People who were just misunderstood. Let's go back a little. After the Civil War, public schooling became a little bit more widespread. We've talked about that in previous lectures. In South Carolina, African Americans dominated the State House and rewrote the Constitution for the state of South Carolina. So the 1868 state convention that Ed mentioned a little bit earlier, that's where we get public schools in South Carolina from. They mandated public schools in South Carolina. Now they mandated it, that doesn't mean it got funded. A lot of that did not get funded. The framework was there, but the money was not. I'm sure all of you have experienced things that, or you just hear in the news. They passed this legislation. Great, but if they don't put any money toward it, nothing's ever really going to happen. So Jim Crow laws really offer us the perfect way of ensuring that white children got the version of history preferred by white Southerners. Well, when you get a chance afterwards, I'd ask you to come up. I know you can't see a lot of these images here, but you look at the true image of separate but equal. It's kind of jumping up in time on you. When you see these beautiful classrooms of smiling white children, and you see these black kids crowded around a boiler in a classroom, that was considered separate but equal during that time period. Separate but equal meant they are separate and they both have schools. They don't have to be good schools. They just gotta have schools. And I remember growing up in Philadelphia. I grew up in the Philadelphia school system from the 70s through graduated from high school in '82. I remember old torn up textbooks that we used grocery store bags to cover. Anybody remember those old brown? Yeah. Use them grocery store bags to cover them up, to hold the covers together. And that's what we were handed down by the, I guess, better schools. I see a head shaking back there. You understand exactly what I'm saying, right? Got a witness. That's what we were given back even in my day in Philadelphia. So you have these older school buildings. Here, you look at this school bus. If a black school got a school bus, it wasn't very nice. It wouldn't have been the newest, definitely wouldn't be these nice electric buses that my school definitely doesn't have. I teach out in Cross, I'm out in the boondocks. You know, we push start our trucks, our buses. Old buildings that they would have their schoolhouses in, of course unheated, or if they did, they maybe have a potbelly stove like you see here. All these kids huddled around, crowded in a room with a big old potbelly stove. Now I know back in the day, everybody really started that way. But it seemed to have lasted a lot longer when it came to a lot of these African American students in these African American schools. I mean, I'd love to hear some stories about some of the schools that you guys attended. So some of you look in here look like you might be a year or two older than me. So you may have some stories of your own to tell. So Jim Crow laws were adopted in the South basically to, as they would say, keep Negroes in their place. Keep them in their place. Make sure they don't go too far or become too successful. What would that include? Everything. Separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, separate schools, separate cemeteries. I saw a law where it was against the law for a black person and a white person to play checkers. Think about that. How silly can you really get with some of these laws? Right? You go back and study the history of black people dying on the front steps of a white hospital because they can't get in. Those kind of things were going on in the South. But this is something I like to talk to my students about. And Ed and I were talking about this recently. When we talk about Jim Crow, we don't often fully understand what that meant. Jim Crow was not whites against African Americans. It was not. Jim Crow was white against everybody else.
That's true.
You either white or you ain't. So what did that mean? That mean Asians dealt with the same stuff. Hispanics dealt with the same stuff. Dark-skinned Native Americans dealt with the same stuff. We forget about that sometimes. That our world, our planet is really not black and white. There's a whole lot of folks in there that we leave out. We're going to talk about some of those folks here today. So we often make the mistake of looking at history like it's always the good-minded, well-meaning people who write textbooks. And yeah, I agree. And they do it for the pure education of our children. That's it, right? Yeah, you would think that. Well, forgive me if any of you are a part of this organization today. I know it still exists. None but love for you. But here in the South, the UDC, United Daughters of the Confederacy, heavily influenced what appeared in textbooks. They had a very strong lobbying organization. Very strong lobbying organization. A lot of influence on Southern legislatures who made those decisions. And some of you might know this particular name. Here in Somerville lived a man named William Gilmore Simms. Mr. Simms was the primary author of South Carolina textbooks. All the way up to his family influenced that, all the way down to his granddaughter up into the 1980s. Any of you ever used a Simms book in school? Uh-huh. A couple of you did. So that was control. That was control of the narrative. When they say education is power, it truly is. Education is power. Controlling education controls power. Today, most of the states use statewide textbook adoption policies. New editions appeased Southerners, essentially publishing separate versions of the Civil War in textbooks for those in the South versus those in the North. In the South, the editions reinforced the lost cause narrative for those textbooks. I want you to look at a couple of these pages, and you may want to come and see these later afterwards when you get a chance to. I can't help but laugh every time I see this one. Textbook. See this well-dressed African-American family? That's how blacks came to America.
On a first-class cabin.
Yes! White man shaking black man's hand, welcome aboard. How the Negro lived under slavery. I like, they even doubled down. They had the white guy working. The white guys are working, the black guys just being seen to his cabin. That's how we got here, right? Is that the story you heard? I love this one. The caption in this book reads, "When the day's work was done, the plantation Negroes enjoyed themselves."
And they were
They having a good old time, right? It's the regular hoedown. They enjoyed themselves. This is probably my favorite. In this textbook, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Patrick Henry were abolitionists. These are three of the largest slave owners in the history of America. But if you read the text, you actually read the text up here, they were trying to end slavery. These great Americans. Yeah. I remember I was, any kids in here? No kids in here, right? I was doing some research last week, and I was reading about Patrick Henry. And we were talking about the Constitution, the development of the Constitution. And of course, the Constitution was greatly changed due to the influence of the Southern slave owner. And Patrick Henry was against the Constitution, and he wrote in a letter, he specifically says, "They're coming for your niggers." Saying that the Constitution was going to end slavery. That sound like an abolitionist? Yeah. But that just gives you an idea of what really kept this narrative alive. In school, we kids, we just, okay, that must be right. I mean, you got crazy enough people now to believe stuff on the internet is true.
It isn't?
So imagine if your teacher told you that this is the way things work. And your textbook tells you this is the way things work.
And you got tested on it.
And you got tested on it. You better get it right. You better get it right. Very, very good point. Officials even counted textbook lines to make sure it mentioned Jefferson Davis or Robert E. Lee as many times as it mentioned Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. That was a requirement. Had to mention them equal. Equal bullying is fair enough, right? Equal bullying. Another example is how the book depicts Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Most of you, what was that assassination about? What was the plan? What was the whole thing? What was supposed to happen that night? Real simple, right? John Wilkes Booth went and killed Lincoln. That's what you learn, right?
Start a new civil war.
There were other assassinations.
They were going after others.
Ed, stop it! He does this every time. Yeah, it was a much bigger plot.
Much bigger.
They were going after the Secretary of State, Stanton. They were going after the Vice President. All of them were supposed to die that night, not just Lincoln. But why do we only talk about John Wilkes Booth? Because John Wilkes Booth was the northerner in that group. He was from the north. So you can't blame the South for the assassination of Lincoln because some crazy northerner went and blew his head off. They didn't talk about the Southern conspirators in that. When you talk about the whole plot, it was Southern conspirators in that plot. And then later in the Northern textbooks, they really amped it up further and just dismissed John Wilkes Booth as an insane actor. Right? That's the whole story of the killing of Abraham Lincoln, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. All right, so by 1930s, Northern authors had begun mimicking their Southern counterparts, ignoring the conspiracy altogether. Let's not even talk about it. Kind of like slavery in the South, right? Let's not even talk about it. So these are deeply held beliefs that are going to be kind of hard to shake as long as you're being taught that in the schools and it's being reinforced in the homes. All right, moving on. Y'all still love me? You good? Go ahead.
You're always talking about the public schools. Were there any religious schools going on?
Oh, heck yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
Besides the Catholic schools?
Yes. That's really more Ed's area, but yeah, there were definitely religiously, the earliest schools, the first schools in America, really by the Puritans, were started by the Puritans. And those schools were specifically to make sure that every child, boy and girl, by the way, boy and girl must be able to read the Bible. So that's when they started their first schools. The first college in America, Harvard University, in case you didn't know that was the first college. First college in America was a seminary. Harvard started to train the priests. Oh, you got a Harvard graduate there or something?
No, I grew up in the town where John Harvard lived and died.
Ah, okay. And that's the first college in America. All about teaching them how to read the Bible. So your earliest schools were those religious schools. Mainly for reading the Bible, but of course they got some other stuff in there as well. So, any other questions about the Jim Crow or the lost cause part of it before I move on? Yes?
Was Jim Crow a person?
No, good question.
This has bothered me all day.
Jim Crow was a character in a minstrel show.
In blackface.
In blackface.
Oh.
So they would, and I always get the words wrong, but, so forgive me, the words are not accurate, but the character's on stage dressed like the worst, dirty, broke down slave you can possibly be. Mm-hmm. And he's dancing around going, and then you hop around, jump Jim Crow. And that's where it comes from.
Oh. Thank you.
That song in a minstrel show. And you had children's toys that were, you can wind them up. And you have that blackface earrings. That'd be your child's Christmas present.
They still have those.
They do?
Yes. So excellent question. Excellent question. A lot of people think, well, who's this Jim Crow that started these laws? No, some more of the laws are nicknames from the minstrel show. Jim Crow. Wow. I never had that question before. Excellent. Yes.
Well, it must have been a challenge to try to teach illiterates to read the Bible. I even have a problem.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
King James.
For sure. Like, I don't even read King James anymore. I know.
Well, I wondered how they did it.
That's too much work.
Yeah.
I love the word, but yeah, that's a lot of work. And when I teach the Bible, it's not King James. Because especially I've taught everywhere from kindergarten, Bible school, all the way up through adults. And you definitely don't want to try the these and thous with a 6-year-old. You don't want to do that.
Yeah,
You just,
it's been
you just
hard
put on
for
the veggie tails and go for it. Right? But yes, it would be very difficult. Let's talk some good stuff. I love talking about the good stuff of South Carolina. Tea Picker School for indigent black children at Pinehurst Tea Gardens. This story is fascinating to me. I love this story. Somerville celebrates itself as the birthplace of sweet tea, right? Well, that wouldn't be possible without the tea plantation, without the tea gardens, right? And that wouldn't be possible without the young African-American tea pickers. And that's where the story goes now. I call Pinehurst Tea Plantation a scientific and sociological marvel, because it really was. Scientifically, because it was very difficult to grow tea in America on a large scale, right? It was grown in America over 150 years. People bringing in tea from China, but trying to get it to grow on a large enough scale to create a commercial industry with this type of climate was not easy. It was not easy at all. But then we had the blessings of, we had the blessings of Dr. Charles Shepherd, who was the first one to really find a way to commercially grow tea in America. So this is him here. This is Dad. Great family. His dad was a chemistry professor at MUSC. It wasn't called MUSC at the time. It was a Medical College of South Carolina.
Yeah.
Right? So he worked there. Then when he died, his son actually took his spot on the faculty, and he was there, classically trained. So having that knowledge, bringing that here to Somerville was very, very helpful. So let me talk about him just a little bit. Came from a family of professionals, and I like when it talks about how they had higher ideals, and making money was not the guiding force of this family. And that's a beautiful thing. He was educated in Massachusetts, graduated from Yale, sorry Harvard, went on to receive a medical degree from University in Germany, went on even further to get a degree in agriculture, later replacing his father at MUSC. In 1888, he founded the Pinehurst Tea Plantation, experimented with tea that he brought back from his studies in the Orient. Variety of tea known as oolong. That variety of tea that he grew won first place at the 1904 World's Fair. So very successful. According to Dr. Shepherd, by 1903, we had upwards of 93 acres of tea hedges. It was producing some 10,000 pounds of tea per year. That's a lot today, let alone in 1888. That's a whole lot today. Not only was tea grown, but many other rare and exotic trees, plants, shrubs, making it one of the greatest gardens in all of the United States. So it's way beyond just being a tea plantation. Give you an idea what type of man he was. I like trying to find out who I'm talking about. When Dr. Shepherd was asked, what is the sport, amusement, form of exercise, or mode of relaxation which you enjoy and find helpful? He replied, charity schools for both races.
Charity what?
Charity schools.
Charity.
Charity.
Charities.
Yes, charity schools for both races. This leads us to why Pinehurst was a sociological marvel. Instead of exploiting African Americans during that period of Reconstruction, he decided to work with them. He made a deal with African American families. If you will lend me your young children to pick the tea, I will build a school and educate them. And that's exactly what he did. Tea was harvested mostly by African American children, for whom he provided a school in the winter. And first-hand testimony is a beautiful thing. Because I talked about this, I do work with the Library of Congress. I'm a mentor on the Library of Congress, a fellow with the Library of Congress. And I did a posting about this on the Library of Congress, and a woman asked me, do you know of anyone who's ever actually worked there? Do you have any stories from people who worked there? I'm like, no, that's a darn good question. And then Dr. West comes on. Like, hey, check this out. And when we have Earlene Singleton, spent 7 years as a tea picker and a student at Pinehurst. Yes, it's nice to get those first-hand accounts. Of course, she's gone now. According to her, all the school children picked tea after they were about 12 or 13 years old. She went on to say that picking began in May, with the larger children starting first. Then as school let out, younger ones started, and all continued until the hot weather was over. That tells me the tea didn't grow very well in the cooler weather. So you see, now, obviously I went just nuts. Library of Congress has a lot, and also there's another site that has a lot of images of the tea plantation. This is only a handful. There's like 20 or 30 images they have in a book on the Pinehurst Tea Gardens. Beautiful pictures. You look at it, like I said, afterwards, take your time, check them out. After he died in 1915, the plantation closed, and the tea just grew wild for the next 45 years. Just grew wild. Later, cuttings from these plants were taken to create fields at both the American Tea Growing Company and the Charleston Tea Plantation. So that heritage is still alive here in the South. Despite his death, the gift he provided those children would go on to enhance their lives and granted them a portion of true freedom through education at Somerville. Any questions about the tea gardens?
Isn't that where the country club is?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
We have some of the.
I was looking at it on a map today. If you go down Bacon Bridge Road, where the old Newington plantation was, that's where the gardens were. And they covered, obviously, a lot of areas. You had 93 acres of just the tea.
The new cut of the sawmill of the Erlenmeyer's Parkway is going across the southern edge of the tea farm.
It's right there where the canal is.
So it'd be interesting. I know there's well, it's almost redundant to say there's a housing development. That's redundant to say, right? Yes.
Did Dr. Shepherd get a federal grant in 1884?
Yeah, he had federal funding to support his start.
Okay.
Originally it was a federal project. It was a Department of Education project, Department of Agriculture project in 1885. It's called an experiment station, where they were trying to see whether it would work or not. It did work, but they couldn't do it commercially.
Do you know how much you got?
How much you got?
To start?
But in the research, I also found it fascinating about his dad. His dad definitely had an impact on this area. I mean, have you ever driven down Ashley Phosphate Road? Mm-hmm. His dad was the one that found a lot of the phosphate deposits in South Carolina. In case you don't know, Ashley Phosphate Road is named that because it led to the phosphate mines. And so there's a lot of, which one is it? I think it's, no, I'm trying to think of the plantation that you can see a lot of that phosphate on the main house that they use to coat.
Oh, you're talking about Magnolia.
Yes, yes, that house, with right above the gardens. All right, so let's switch to our, yes, ma'am.
Apparently I had a misconception here. I thought that the tea farm, Dr. Shepherd's tea farm had adult workers.
It did.
And, oh, okay.
It did.
And then.
That's why I said mostly
Children
the
and
children.
adult
Yes.
workers.
Yes. And the children just did the picking. That tea still had to be processed. Had to be hauled off, had to be chopped up, had to be processed, had to be, what do you call it, cured, packaged, all that. Those were adults doing most of that work. But those little hands came into play, picking those 3 little leaves at the top of the plant. That's all they did. Pick the 3 little leaves at the top, keep them in their pouch, keep them in mind. And I failed to mention also that part of it was not just the school. Those kids got paid based on their weight of the tea leaves that they picked. They got paid. So they got an education and they got a salary. That's wonderful. Basically. So that's one of the beauties of that story. You don't see that often. You see people get exploited and used, but for them to get paid and educated, hey, not bad. It's more than I make here.
I'll talk to the boss.
Just a joke. I love volunteering.
We appreciate it too. Your salary's been doubled, okay?
Thank you.
So now we're going to talk about another group that we often leave out, and that is the Native American population, the American Indians of this area. You really can't tell any story in American history and leave them out, because they were the first permanent inhabitants of these lands. I tell my students all the time, when I say permanent inhabitants, Nobody, no human beings occupied these lands. None. It was just the animals and the trees. Until those first Native Americans, many believe, came over from Alaska when during the Bering Sea froze over. They walked over during the Ice Age across the ice bridge. The first inhabitants being those Native Alaskans coming out of Russia and Alaska and all that. So that's how our lands were first populated on a large number, following the herds across that ice bridge. But as we continue to celebrate this history, we move on to the American Indian. As with all the people and groups we discuss in this series, we're going to discuss how they benefited from kindnesses from the people here in Somerville. And we'll talk about one of our favorite people to discuss here in Somerville. The story starts at historic landmark, St. Paul's Church. You heard of it? 1883, Reverend LeGrand F. Urey, did I say that right? Urey? Pastor of St. Paul's, decided to grow the church by reaching out to the rural communities. When I say rural communities, I'm not just talking about the American Indian. I'm talking about mountain whites as well. Any of those poor, uneducated people on the outskirts of town, he invited in to the church. First service, they believe,